As the political slugfest intensifies over growth numbers, we have one of the most authoritative voices to talk on this debate. Former Finance Minister Chidambaram joins us right here on ET Now. Thank you very, very much for joining us. It obviously is a big political slugfest, but I first want to speak to you about a clarification that has come in, and it says the estimates in the report are not official estimates and are meant only to facilitate taking a decision. The recommendations of the NSE committees will be examined by the Ministry of Statistics, Planning and Implementation and other experts for deciding on the appropriate methodology. Have you jumped the gun too early?
Certainly not. The report itself says there are three approaches. One is based on using the base data wherever available. Another is the production shift approach. And the third is to project the old series using the base year 2004-05 forwards up to 2014-15, then adjust it to 2011-12. And they clearly say that we have studied the three approaches and we are presenting it on the basis of the production shift approach. But they also comment on the CSO's earlier estimates by saying the CSO's estimates are tentative estimates and need to be deliberated on by the Advisory Committee of National Account Statistics. So every estimate is based on a method, a methodology, certain assumptions, and it has to be deliberated. But why dismiss these results as inconsequential? I don't think any methodology will yield a result very different from the results presented by Mr. Mandal and Mr. Banamurthy.
I understand it can't be diametrically opposite to what the committee has come out with. But let me begin with the political allegation that has been put on you and your party. And it says that you and the Congress are being accused of using series growth to score over a political point. There seems to be, you had an issue with this series before it had started off, and now there is this selective endorsement. How are you going to defend that charge?
We are not the authors of the report. The report is a semi-official committee or an official committee.
But are you now fine with this GDP series because you had issues with it earlier?
We don't know the methodology adopted by the CSO. The MCA 21 data was not made available to the public. All that we are saying is an official or a semi-official committee consisting of many economists, two of them very well known, Mr. Mandal and Mr. Banamurthy, have presented this data. Now we therefore say this data points, underline, this data points to the conclusion that the growth rate in UPA 1 and 2 was far higher than the growth rate in NDA 1 and 2. Is that a wrong conclusion?
Perhaps not, and I'm going to come to the figures just yet. NDA 1, and you know, that's another allegation that comes in while you're trying to be selective in pointing out the heady growth rate of 10%. What you're conveniently missing out on is that NDA 1 handed over the baton to UPA 1 at growth rates of about over 8% and rising. UPA 2 passed it on to NDA 2 at 6%. Are you using facts selectively?
No. Please understand, in the 5 years of NDA 1, the growth was less than 5% in 2 years, just barely 5% in 1 year, and crossed 7 and crossed 8 in 1 year each. The 8.08, which the new report says, based on market prices, is upon previous year of 3.73.
So there was a base year impact.
The base year was so low that any growth will show up very high, 8.08. That is why we take the average of the 5 years, and the average of the 5 years comes to 5.68. And I have done nothing more than take the average of UPA 1, 8.36, and the average of UPA 2, 7.68. So what is wrong about this calculation? You don't take one odd year out of 5 and say we handed over a baton. The economy was certainly not rising. That year, because of the previous year being a very low base, showed a high growth. But I'm not grudging the 8.08. All I'm saying is you add the 8.08 but the average comes to 5.68.
But 8.08 can't be a flash in the pan. It certainly is an upswing, because if you see growth levels that followed from there, fiscal year 2005, the growth rate was at 8.15. It was then 9.6, 9.7, and then a very heady growth rate of 10.23.
But you certainly don't attribute it to the outgoing government.
No, I don't. But you know, this 8.08 wasn't a flash in the pan. It
Who
was
said?
an economy on the upswing.
Did I use the word
No,
flash
you
in
did
the
not.
pan? All I said is 8.08 is a bit of a exaggeration because it's based on a very low base, a 3.73. When you look at the other four numbers, 8.15 is upon 8.08, 9.6 is upon 8.15, 9.7 is upon 9.6, 10.23 is upon 9.7. The clear rise was in UPA 1 the first 4 years, which Dr. Arvind Subramanian, until recently the chief economic advisor, said the boom years.
That's right.
Now, why do you grudge the UPA credit for the clear rising trend based on high growth in the previous year?
No, I understand that, and in many ways I think the Congress party and your former Prime Minister stands vindicated. But the question also is that one of the allegations that's coming from the Congress is that the Modi government, which is the present NDA 2, has been blessed with a very benign oil regime, and yet they could not capitalize on it too much. The reality is that you were also blessed with very heady global growth in terms of exports. The average export growth in UPA 1 and UPA 2 was upwards of 12%. We all know exports has slumped, and that's a big driver of engine, is it not? So they may have been benefited with oil, but they've been at the receiving end of exports.
The difference is we had a benign or helpful external environment.
That's right.
And we made use of it. They had an equally benign external environment because of a crash in oil prices, crash in commodity prices, and they did not make use of it. That's the difference.
Okay, your detractors will say you're wrong, but let me be the
Why am I
will tell you
wrong?
why. I will tell you why I'll
Why
be the
am I
devil's
wrong?
advocate. No, you're not wrong in terms of the oil, the way they handle. I agree.
I'm accepting your statement, but we made best use of the benign external environment. They did not make use of the benign external environment caused by a crash, not a decline, a crash, a collapse in oil prices and commodity
I
prices.
will appreciate your point on the commodity crash and on oil prices. Perhaps they could not leverage it as well as a government should have at that point in time.
That's the point.
But what about exports? Exports growth the world over had slumped. Indian exports were not growing at the level at which they were growing under your government.
I'm afraid you're wrong. Indian exports did not grow. Indian exports declined.
That's right.
For the 4 years, the growth is negative growth.
So how do you compare export negative growth with a very heady 12% export growth? Because that is a very robust engine of
Indian
growth.
export growth is negative.
Yes.
Not the world growth is not negative. World growth is positive. Indian export growth is negative, which is perhaps why I said tongue in cheek, the then Commerce Minister was rewarded with a Defence Ministership.
Okay, I'm not going to get into the politics of this, but
Well,
I'm going to come to you with an allegation. Rajiv Kumar of the Niti Aayog, Vice Chairman there, says that the higher growth rate in 2009 to 2011 and in previous years was funded by untenable fiscal deficit and reckless expansion of bank credit. I'll come to bank credit in just a while. But was the response to the global economic crisis the fiscal steroid, and the economy was growing on the back of that?
I have to take exception to the words "and previous years." Prior to 2009-10, there was no reckless spending, there was no reckless borrowing. So he's wrong there. The growth that was achieved between 2004-5 and 2007-8 was based on prudent fiscal management. 2008-9 was the worst international financial crisis since the Great Depression. In fact, it is called the Great Recession.
That's right.
We managed it competently. Our growth slumped. The world growth crashed. Most countries had negative growth. Yet we registered 4.15 under the new series market prices, 7.16 under the old series, be that as it may.
Yes.
Then Mr. Mukherjee took over. I left the finance ministry, Mr. Mukherjee took over. Now, you can argue whether one fiscal stimulus was good, the second was good, the third was necessary. You can argue. But to be fair to Mr. Mukherjee, he followed the textbook. What did the textbook say? The textbook says, in times of a decline in growth, a decline in investment, private investment, the textbook says, spend more. Keynesian, spend more. So he did relax the fiscal deficit limits, he did borrow, and he did spend. That did cause high fiscal deficit and high inflation. But the positive was that we revived growth, and we had growth of 8.84, 10.78, and 6.96 until the European crisis hit us. Whoever would have been in place in Mr. Mukherjee's place, I don't know what he would have done differently.
What would you have done? Would you have gone for this, if I may say, and I'm using my words very carefully, would you have gone for reckless spending?
It was not reckless spending, it was public
spending. Look at fiscal
spending.
deficit levels, those went up, they were shot through the roof.
That is excessive borrowing, but the spending was genuine spending.
Would you have done that?
Well, it's hindsight. I have the benefit of hindsight. I would have done the first fiscal stimulus package. I would have held back on the second. And certainly I would not have done a third package. But then, a finance minister has to be eventually guided by the Prime Minister.
So are you saying Dr. Manmohan Singh was responsible for high fiscal deficit?
No, I didn't say that. I said the finance minister.
You can't divorce the finance ministry from your tenure to Mr. Mukherjee's tenure.
Not.
This was one government. No, you're not. No, you're not. But this is one government that was continuing in power.
That's what I'm trying to explain.
So you can't look at growth figures in isolation of high inflation and high fiscal deficit.
I'm only saying that Mr. Mukherjee followed the textbook. Therefore, you can't fault him. In hindsight, if you have the benefit of hindsight, I think it's possible to argue, as Dr. Srinivasan has argued, that the first stimulus package was necessary. The second was, you could take a call one way or other. And the third was perhaps avoidable. But that's a viewpoint. One must respect that, and one must learn lessons for the future.
No, I'll tell you why I'm saying we can't look at this in isolation. Because higher fiscal deficit, very high inflation, high interest rates, and then there was excessive borrowing that was happening, excessive credit lending was happening. And many people believe that was perhaps the genesis of the NPA problem. You had twin let me finish my question. You had twin balance sheets problem, you had overcapacity, and now you have low utilization on account of that. Doesn't it all go back to
No, it doesn't. Complete rubbish. I stood up in Parliament and asked the question. Now tell us, how much lending was there after 2014-15 and how much of that has become NPA? They refuse to answer that question. They have not answered it so far. Please ask the government, loans given after 2014-15 or in 2014-15 and after, how many of them have become NPAs? Why don't they release that figure? I can't believe a government in the 5th year of its tenure, 4 years and 3 months, will still talk about legacy. The legacy is your own legacy.
You being candid on the fiscal deficit, you're not being as candid on credit offtake. You're not being as candid on...
What is wrong with...
Don't you think there was indiscriminate lending that happened because of the fiscal steroids?
No, I don't agree. I don't agree. What is wrong with 14% credit growth? What is wrong is the current credit growth has slumped to 8.27% in 2017-18. Only now it's picked up. It's now crossed 12%. Now suppose this credit growth picks up further and goes to 14%. Would you call it reckless credit growth?
But this is also a time when the world economy is turning around. This is also the time when capacity utilization is going up.
But the same problem was faced by Mr. Mukherjee. That was the time when we had to turn around India's economy. When the world went into a huge fiscal stimulus package. What did US do? What did Europe do? What did Japan do? So there are other countries of the world which adopted the same path.
But will you agree that the halt in investments that began under your government, and you tried to do a lot to push it, continued well into this government, is a function of the fact that capacity utilization was at very low levels? It's only beginning to pick up now.
Please, let me ask you a question. Why is the power sector capacity utilization 60%? Is it because we are surplus in power? Is it because there's no demand for power? Why is it 60%, I want to know? Why is the plant load factor of many thermal power plants well below 60% today? I mean, the point is, this government has proved to be incompetent in managing the economy. And I'm not getting into other areas of competence and incompetence.
I'll come to
in managing the economy, they have proved to be incompetent. Investment, GFCF, gross fixed capital formation, has slumped by 3% from the time they took over, by 6% from the peak. Credit has slumped by almost 6%. Credit to industry was until 2017-18 near zero or negative. So investment is low, credit growth is slow or sluggish, and growth has slumped. How can I say that they are competent economic managers?
No, I'll tell you why. I'm just going to voice the defense that comes from the other sides. They say that we have to deal with the legacy of massive NPAs, deleveraging of bank credit, and uncertain global trade environment where exports have slipped.
Listen,
and a world that's increasingly looking inwards.
At no time will all factors be in your favor. There will always be some factor or other which is against you. You must know how to manage. I shudder to think what they would have done if they were in office in 2008 and the international financial crisis hit them. Why don't you give credit to Dr. Manmohan Singh?
Or oil at 140.
Yeah, 145 the first week of July 2008. Therefore, why don't you give credit to Dr. Manmohan Singh and his government for managing the most challenging economic environment the world has faced in 50 years. 1,000 banks collapsed in the US alone. In England, banks collapsed. In Germany, a bank collapsed. Not one bank collapsed in India.
It may have not collapsed then, but a lot of people believe the fault lines are very visible today. But
I'll tell you, if God forbid, if this government is elected again for another term, they will still blame the legacy of Dr. Manmohan Singh.
No, I'm not going to get into the political blame game, but you're known to be you're known to be fiscally prudent to the point that people may even call you a fiscal hawk.
But I did tighten the fiscal
deficit
in the 1.5 years that I had before elections.
Yes.
I did contain the current account deficit to 1.7. What is the current account deficit now? At the end of 2017-18, current account deficit had touched 2%.
That's right.
I had contained it to 1.7%. And this year I'm told 2018-19, current account deficit will cross 2%, may even go up to 2.3 or 2.4.
So that's exactly the point. You were fiscally prudent in hindsight, and we have the benefit of hindsight now. You're proud of the growth numbers that you produce, but are you equally proud of the inflation and the fiscal?
No, I'm not. I'm not. That's what I'm trying to say. We had to stimulate the economy. Mr. Mukherjee adopted 3 stimulus packages. Hindsight, you can argue this way and that way. We paid a price in terms of high inflation and high fiscal deficit. But in the year and a half that I had, I did contain the fiscal deficit sharply, and I did contain the current account deficit to very, very creditable limits.
You're also blamed for cutting down on spending.
What choice did you have? You can't have everything. You can't say, I'll contain the fiscal deficit, I'll contain the current account deficit, but I will spend. You would have called me also reckless. You can't have everything. It is every decision is contextual. Every decision is based upon how you find the economy at any given time.
But does that not curtail economic activity to a point that your numbers on the fisc may look good, but the economic activity gets curtailed?
But nevertheless, we handed over an economy that was growing at 6.39%. Now tell me, well, I can tell you, there are 100 prime ministers and presidents all over the world who would be willing to give one arm and one leg for 6.39% growth. Is 6.39 rate of growth something to be mocked at? You inherited an economy with a current account deficit of 1.7, a fiscal deficit that had been sharply compressed, 6.39% growth. You should have built on it. And let me give them credit. They did. In the first 2 years, they did. And I have complimented them earlier The first 2 years, they managed it reasonably well,
At
7.41 and 8.15. Then they committed the big blunders. Demonetization, flawed implementation of GST, and what I call tax terrorism.
Will you concede that UPA 1 had heady good growth and you were actually voted back in 2009 because of high growth and not the dole-outs? And will you also concede in the same breath that the verdict in 2014 was against low growth?
Please remember the last year of UPA 1, we had very low growth, 4.15, the 2008 crisis.
True.
Nevertheless, we were voted back to power because people accepted our argument that we had produced high growth with employment, but we were hit by an international crisis. So we voted back to power. The second time, people did not accept that argument. People said, all right, you've got a second term, you've done your best, you have maintained growth, but at the cost of high inflation and a high fiscal deficit. High inflation mainly.
Was high inflation a big red in your report card?
I think so. I think high inflation was a big red in the UPA 2 report card.
I will quickly come to the rupee and, this whole economic management of NDA. Your party has accused the government of pushing and doing the unthinkable, which is pushing the rupee beyond 70. But isn't the exchange rate a function of global factors, just like it was in 2013? Just like you were falsely accused in 2013, are you just returning the favor today?
No, I said this morning that I won't comment on the exchange rate.
Because you agree with them?
I won't comment on the exchange rate. But all I would say is, what did you say before you came to power? Both candidate Mr. Narendra Modi and the leader of the opposition, Ms. Sushma Swaraj, are on record that if they come to power, the rupee will trade at 40 rupees to a dollar. So we are only holding the mirror to them and say, this is what you said and this is what you are delivering. Please explain why.
But as somebody who's been at the helm in finance ministry, do you sympathize with the fact that
why are you asking me this question?
That rupee management is beyond their control? It's global factors,
well,
and
right,
EM currencies have lost clout. A dollar is strengthening.
You are asking the question to the wrong person. I didn't promise 40 rupees a dollar. They did. Be that as it may. I am willing to concede that the exchange rate is not entirely under the control of the government. But clearly, there are some things which can be done to offset the depreciation of the exchange rate so that we are not hit by price rise, we are not hit by import compression, we are not hit by high deficits. But this government is doing nothing. It's standing by and watching the rupee depreciate, which, let's assume for the sake of argument, it's not entirely under the control of the government. But as the rupee depreciates, what are you doing to offset the negative effects of a depreciating rupee? Now, you tell me, what have they done in the last month, 1, 2, 3, to offset the effects of a depreciating rupee? I can't find anything.
If anything, forex reserves have dipped by about $25 billion. Two quick...
That leads to
another debate.
Very interesting debate, but we will have it another day. Why are they depleting foreign exchange reserves if they believe that the exchange rate is beyond their control? Anyway, we won't get into that because that will take too much time.
You have made demonetization the devil that cost India its economic growth.
It is.
It did not cost India 2 percentage points to the GDP.
It did,
like
1.5.
It has cost 0.4%.
Sorry. From 8.15 in 2015-16 to 6.68 in 2017-18 is exactly 1.5%. What I said in Parliament.
I will take a quick question on reforms. NDA 1 before you had gone in for big ticket privatization, telecom licenses, road projects, the whole golden quadrilateral, power reforms. NDA 2 has done the big reset with IBC, the NCLT, GST gradually moving to what you would have envisaged it to be. Will you concede, like some people in the BJP and the government do, that they have laid the foundation for more sustainable, high growth.
Good.
And,
good.
and what would you credit
they are-
UPA 1 and
if-
UPA 2 in terms of reforms
Oh,
too?
come on. Listen, it'll take a long time
Sure.
to make a long list of
But
reforms.
will you concede that they have
Well, if they are good in laying foundations, now that they've laid the foundation, let them make way for somebody who can build a mansion.
Okay, a last question, Mr. Chidambaram. Many polls seem to suggest that the Congress seemingly looking good in Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan and Chhattisgarh. But as far as the centre is concerned, it's Mr. Modi all the way. Is that discouraging?
Well, I don't know. I'm not a pollster. All I know is when the votes are counted and the results are out, we'll know who won and who lost. I'm not in the business of predicting elections, but I devoutly wish that the Congress does well and wins Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh and Rajasthan. And if that happens, I think there is a very good chance that the Congress will win the parliamentary election also.
But you just want them to contest 150 seats and no
I didn't
more.
say that. Again, you read half stories. I didn't say contest 150 seats.
Focus on the 150.
I said focus on the 12 states where we can win 150 seats.
On that note, sir, thanks so much
Thank
for
you.
speaking to us.